Hello, good afternoon. I think we're going to get started just because I don't know about you, but I'm super excited about this presentation today and hearing a little more from our guest speaker, Malkit Shoshan. First of all, if you haven't had a chance to look through the lobby of the GSD at this amazing exhibit that Malkit helped produce with Dan Borelli and the staff here, I want to encourage you to really take some time to absorb the kind of the visuals and kind of the content of what is reflected in the exhibition outside. And maybe we'll hear a little more about that from Malkit today. But I just first of all want to introduce Malkit to some of you. I'm assuming several of the people in the audience know her already, but many of you do not. And I think it's good to have a bit of a deeper understanding of the really important work that Malkit has undertaken over the last several years. She is the founder of an Amsterdam-based architectural think tank called FAST, Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory. The concept of seamless territory, I think, emerges from her deep engagement with and preoccupation with the situation of Israel and Palestine. I guess we'll hear more about the notion of the seamless territory, but I think it's a powerful idea in the contemporary era when we think about boundaries and borders and keeping people out and separating nations, peoples, neighborhoods, territories, to think a little more through the lens of the concept of seamless. And maybe we'll hear more about your practice with that. With respect to that, where that idea comes from. Malkit is also the author of an award-winning book called The Atlas of Conflict, focusing on Israel-Palestine, and that's actually how I first heard about Malkit, because Rosetta Elkin, she and Malkit go way back, said, "Oh, have you seen the Atlas of Conflict?" which I have up in my office, and it's an amazing piece of work. Pardon? That's your copy. Okay, well, you know where it is. It's in my office, on my shelf, on my work on Jerusalem, Israel, the Middle East, and conflict cities. Malkit is also the co-author of the book Village, One Land, Two Systems, and Platform Paradise, and co-editor of a special issue of the journal Footprint called Spaces of Conflict. And that's really what drew Malkit to us here at the GSD. We are fortunate to have Malkit in the region. She's living in New York. She's still practicing, but came last year, taught classes in the Risk and Resilience track in the Master of Design Engineering, Master of Design Studies program. I personally have learned a lot from her because I also am interested in conflict, maybe not the same kind of intractable political conflict that's represented in the relationships, the troubled relationships between Israel and Palestine, but more generally speaking, political and economic conflicts around the world. And she's also taught classes for us, one last spring on Spaces of Solidarity, kind of project, or last fall. And she will be teaching for us again in the spring, and I can't even remember the title of the class, but I highly recommend people sign up, because you're going to get a chance to see a woman who thinks deeply with great political commitment about some of the most pressing struggles and conflicts that people are facing in the contemporary era. I'm not going to say too much more about her work, except to underscore one last thing. When I already knew Malkit, I had an opportunity to go to the Venice Biennale last year and walked into her exhibition called Blue. It was about North African refugees and peacekeeper camps in kind of the context of conflict, migration, and struggles over borders in sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa. And it blew my mind. It was an amazing exhibition. I think it was the best exhibition at the Biennale. And I understand that Malkit is going to be speaking about that a little more on Friday in Pierre Bélanger's class. So anybody who wants a little more of her wisdom can come to the class on Friday. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Malkit for her presentation today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diane, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here, to exhibit the work, and it's a great honor to do that. And thank you, Dan, for helping out installing this, the Border Ecologies exhibition. It's it looks very good, and I'm very happy to see it coming into life here. Okay, so the Border Ecologies exhibition that is showing now at the library includes 5 projects that investigates the diverse influences border dynamics have on the built environment and on people's livelihood. It shows it in different contexts and scales. In my presentation today, I will talk only about 3 of these projects that are taking place in Israel. I was 2 years old when the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat gave his speech at the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem. It was the start of the first peace treaty Israel ever signed with an Arab country. I remember it to be the main topic of the conversation in our house. Everyone talked about the southern border of the country, wondering if the peace is real or not, or if Israel should withdraw from the entire territory or only from part of it. The conversation continued for several years after, and during that time it felt as if Begin, Sadat, and Jimmy Carter were almost these 3 imaginary members of our family. During the 1967 war, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and right after the war, it starts settling it. After its occupation, various groups of Israelis inhabited the Sinai Desert in different ways, carrying different ideas. For example, young nationalist architects designed their dream city and called it Yamit. For them, Yamit was another manifestation of the country ethos, making the desert bloom. At its peak, Yamit had 2,500 residents. Another group of settlers was young Israelis who called themselves beatniks. Exhausted from the ongoing wars, they spontaneously settled and expanded the Bedouin camps along the shorelines of the Red Sea. For this use, moving to the desert was an act of escapism. Next to the ongoing nationalist project and the beatnik movement, the desert got also militarized. The IDF strengthened its hold, building bases and airfields, next to another growing presence of international peacekeeping observers. In 1982, after the peace deal with Egypt came into action, Israel withdrew from Sinai. All this community, except of the peacekeepers, had to be pulled back into Israel. Just one note, my presentation is accompanied with maps, and for the ones of you who are not aware of the borders of Israel, the dark blue is the green line, it's the international recognized border of the country. The blue areas are areas that Israel occupied in different periods, the light blues. Okay. So back to the peace treaty. The peace treaty and the territorial retreat polarized the Israeli public opinion. The territorial nationalist movement became more prominent. It contributed to changing both the political and the physical landscape of the country, amplifying the need to settle and hold onto land. These shifting borders deeply affected our daily experiences. When borders fluctuate, they change everything. They change people's livelihood and their access to places, to resources, and rights. Today, we are witnessing a gradual collapse of the post-colonial borders of the mid-20th century in the Middle East and in Africa. And at the same time, we see the strengthening of the borders around Western countries. We see flow of war and climate refugee from one territory to another, and we watch the rise of walls and militarization of borders from Fortress Europe to the Trump big wall. people and communities are fencing themselves in or fenced out. Now, space is political, and so are architecture and planning. The politics of space is not new. It was theorized at length, amongst other, by French and Italian intellectuals, from Lefebvre to Foucault and Agamben. But I was schooled in the reality of Israel, a country in a constant state of crisis, where the built environment is carefully designed to consolidate and shape national and ideological visions on the ground. In my book, Atlas of the Conflict, Israel-Palestine, that Diane just mentioned, the first chapter is dedicated to explore and illustrate the issue of borders. The state of Israel has no fixed borders or undisputed borders. From the moment of its establishment in 1948, its frontiers have been in a perpetual flux, annexing, separating, isolating, and dividing territories. Ceasefire lines, international demarcation, withdrawal zones, and security barriers have all left their marks on the land. The absence of official borders or the presence of so many unofficial ones has generated a unique spatial condition whereby the state is compelled to keep inventing new ways to guard its territory. As a result, borders are internationalized, small as well as large area of lands are either fenced in or fenced out, included or excluded, together with people access to resources and rights. Each border fluctuation influenced the built environment and people's livelihood. We see in the distribution, for instance, of dots here on the map. The blue dots represent Israeli localities, and the brown ones represent Palestinian localities. And you see that these are the settlements in Sinai Peninsula, this triangle. And you see that there is a perpetual expansion, evacuation, and concentration of localities over a relatively very short time. Over the past century, if you look at this Israeli landscape, over the past century, two major processes, construction and destruction, have been happening at the same time. Over 500 Palestinian villages have been destroyed, and thousands of new localities have been built. The process of construction and destruction was influenced by three major factors. First is the continuation of the Zionist project that meant creating facts on the ground and using settlements and population groups to define Israeli dominance over the landscape. The second factor had to do with political events, such as war, treaties, and changes in government, which have shifted borders, leading to displacement, destruction, construction, and again, evacuation. The third factor had to do with ideological shifts. The move of the country from socialism to capitalism resulted in change of settlements' shape, typology, and density. For example, the communal localities of the 1950s transformed into state-sponsored gated communities in the 1980s and to individual settlements in the 1990s. These strong links between borders, distribution, and type of settlement is explored in the settlement typology of the book of the Atlas. Settlement typologies have played an important role in shaping the landscape and life for Palestinians and Israelis. In this chapter, what I try to do is to bring forward an overview of the most prevalent typology of both groups from the 19th century onward, using maps, diagrams, photographs, and statistics. I would like to mention a few of them. For example, I just talked about it, but this is an important part of the Israeli landscape. In the period before and after the establishment of Israel, more than 500 Palestinian villages were demolished. Most of them were bulldozed to the ground, and new towns were built on top of them. Very little trace of them remained. However, some ruins are still visible, scattered across the Israeli landscape, fragments of walls, pavements, fruit trees, and cactus plants. And these are all almost like testaments of a former Palestinian presence in the land. At the same time, if you look at the Israeli landscape, a lot of different typologies have emerged to adapt themselves and adjust themselves to this state of crisis. Like, for instance, the first UN refugee camp emerged along the borders of Israel to provide shelter to the 1948 Palestinian refugees. Already then, the UN agency UNRWA have placed more than 700,000 Palestinians in camps. These camps are spread across the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. They were built gradually and slowly became permanent. The protracted, unresolved refugee crisis, the dense and limited grid of the camps, and the natural demographic growth of the residents, who currently number more than 4 million people, have created an extremely dense space. The basic cubic shelter that the UN provided have expanded into building with 4 to 7 floors, leaving minimal open space in between. On the other side, on the blue side, on the Israeli side of the map, another reality was forming. One of them is the Wall and Tower. During the Second World War, there was a high pressure on the Jewish settlement in Palestine to create a new reality on the ground and basically start a homeland. This pressure can be traced in a typology of construction, also known as tower and stockade. It was built hastily, often overnight, to become a so-called fact on the ground. The wall and tower gave rise to 53 new settlements, generating a territorial continuation of the Jewish presence in the landscape. Over time, such settlements helped define the borders of the state while evolving into permanent typologies as well. Two other typologies that I would like to quickly mention are the community settlements and the unrecognized Palestinian villages. The 1980s saw peak in the construction of state-sponsored gated communities located mainly in areas dominated by Palestinian presence in the north of Israel and in the West Bank. Geographically, community settlements were situated on hilltops. The star settlements were part of the community settlement typology, and they aimed at changing the demographic balance of the hills running along the eastern part of the Israeli border or the green line with the West Bank. The scope of the so-called Seven-Star Master Plan was to move over 100,000 Jewish settlers into this area. The plan included the creation of new localities, a highway, industrial, and employment centers. The initiative was accompanied by a massive housing demolition campaign for the existing Palestinian cities in the same area. This is the last typology that I'm going to talk about. It's the unrecognized villages. It was not easy to access this typology and definitely not easy to map it. The unrecognized villages, there are more than 80 of them scattered throughout Israel. The majority of them are located in the Negev, in the south of Israel, and some of them are in the north. Internal Palestinian refugees who were not allowed to return to their pre-1948 homes often populated these villages. Sometimes the villages have existed since before the establishment of Israel, but have never been legally recognized. The status of non-recognition means living without access to state services, such as water, electricity, phone lines, roads, or schools. These villages do not appear on the state maps or in any other formal document. The residents have no legal address, and it means that they cannot connect to the water or electricity grid or register their kids to schools, and they cannot vote. So if you don't have an address in a modern state, you need to face this incredible bureaucracy and fight daily the bureaucracy of the state. When I started this research, I lived in Haifa, and I found out that there is a small NGO very close to my home. The NGO supported the residents of the unrecognized villages. I scheduled an appointment and went there and asked if they can help me to draw a map of these villages. They agreed, and in the process, I met Muhammad Abul Hija. Muhammad was the founder of that NGO. His story and the history of his village were fascinating, and the conversation with him became the departure point of a new project that is documented in the book Village. Both books, Atlas and Village, are part of the Border Ecologies exhibition. The books are complementary to one another. While the Atlas documents and maps the territorial emergence of Israel and the disappearance of Palestine, on a national scale, Village traced the same processes in a scale of one place, one village. It dives into one dot on the map and extrapolates from there multiple stories and personal narratives associated with the complex reality of living in a country that is both filled with violence and a desire to live peacefully. The book Village also documents the encounter between two communities, a village of forcibly displaced community and a group of artists, designers, and architects. The context of this encounter is the village of Ein Hod, and until recently an unrecognized village. It lies in a viewing distance of the inhabitants' former village, which is by now Israeli artist community named Ein Hod. Ein Hod was founded by the Dada artist Marcel Yanko. Village also attempts to bring forward the role art and architecture had in the creation of Israel. During my conversations with Muhammad, the founder of the Association of 40, he told me the history of his village. He told me that his ancestor was Salah ad-Din best warrior, Abu al-Hija. Abu al-Hija helped Salah ad-Din to defeat the Crusaders, and in return, Salah ad-Din gave him lands in Palestine. One of these pieces of land was Ein Hod. A few hundred years later, it resulted with a thriving community of 9,000 inhabitants living in a beautiful village on the foot of Mount Carmel, just south to Haifa. During Israel's War of Independence, the village, or the 1948 war, the village of Ein Hod was confiscated by the Israeli army, and its inhabitants were forced to leave. They were forced to leave. Most of the villagers ended up in refugee camps in the West Bank and in Jordan. However, Muhammad's grandfather, Abu Hilmi, with his wives, daughters, and sons, decided to stay nearby the village. They hide in a prehistoric cave in the mountain, and they hope to go back to the village at the end of the war. But they were never allowed. The village was confiscated by the Israeli army. It was fenced and guarded, and they were considered as trespassers. They had no choice but to slowly rebuild their house elsewhere. Muhammad's grandfather began to build the new Ein Hod only 1 kilometer away and in a viewing distance of his former home. So this is the old Ein Hod, the old village, and that's the new village. This image was taken about 5 years ago. After 1948 war, the confiscated village of Ein Hod was used by the Israeli army as a training facility for urban warfare. In the early 1950s, Marcel Janko, an avant-garde Dada artist and an architect, discovered Ein Hod. Janko was one of the initiators of the Dada movement and of Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. He came originally from Romania, and he moved from Budapest to Zurich during the First World War. He dreaded history and the old world. He was eager to reinvent himself and the arts. During the Second World War, he fled a Nazi pogrom and arrived to Palestine, forced to start a new life. Later on, after the state was established, he was hired by the new government planning authority together with Ariel Sharon. Sharon, not the prime minister or the general, but Sharon, the architect, was trained at the Bauhaus school under the direction of Gropius. The two modernist figures used architecture and art tools to create a new reality on the ground and a new country. While Sharon was conceiving cities to be topped down, Janko was appointed to draw plans for the future national parks. One was building up the country and the other was narrating the unbuilt. During an excursion to the north of the country, Janko discovered the old Palestinian village of Ein Hod. It reminded him of Monte Verita and of his old artistic experimentations in Europe. He fell in love in what he called the staggering beauty of the stone structures, and he asked the new government to let him turn this village into an art commune. The government agreed, and Janko invited his artist friends to join. Together, they started an art experimentation that led to the invention of the modern Israeli identity and culture. They changed the name of the village from Ein Hod, that means in Arabic a place of water, to Ein Hod, that means in Hebrew a place of splendor. They regarded the village as a found object. 30 years later, Janko admitted that Ein Hod was his last Dada act. Hassan Hussein was a family member of Muhammad, and he also had a house in Ein Hod. His home was also caught up in the revival of the European avant-garde in Israel. Gertrude Kraus was an old friend of Janko, and she joined him in Ein Hod. She took Hassan Hussein's house while he ended up in a refugee camp in Jordan. Gertrude tried to immerse herself in the overpowering Palestinian scenery, the walls, the garden, the smells, and the vernacular remains. When Gertrude joined Janko, she was already a famous modern dancer and choreographer. Before fleeing to Palestine, she was the assistant of Rudolf von Laban. Rudolf was the prominent figure in Monte Verita and the founder of modern dance. In Israel, she followed von Laban's steps and invented the Israeli modern dance. And in 1968, she received the first Israel Prize for dance. Although Gertrude dance was about trying to find a new world, she couldn't leave behind her feeling of foreignness. Her desire for belonging was present already in her early work and performances in Europe. One of her first solo dances was called The Strange Guest. She envisioned a diabolic nomad, a mysterious musician played by herself. And the adage of the dance was, "No one asked me to come, but here I am." She tried to perform this dance in Israel, but it was received as a strange gesture. And Gertrude desperately tried the entire time to detach herself from the burden of her unbearable past and from the wars of Europe. In Palestine, she tried to create new, lighter dance inspired by Rudolph. She tried to merge herself with the new climate and let it form her. Inside of Hassan's house, the detachment from history was also apparent. Then the war had left the house deserted and damaged, with an incomplete ceiling and holes in the walls. Concrete blocks were used to patch the missing parts. Gertrude painted Hassan's house white and drew her art on it. The stone arches now appeared separate and detached from the structure. The thin layer of plaster and white paint made the interior function as a white cube. It covered Hassan's labor and allowed the wall to absorb new narratives. The Arab house turned into an eclectic wonder, a collection of objects, ideas, and lifestyle. Its original identity was overwritten. These two realities of Ein Hod and Ein Hod, the Israeli and the Palestinian villages, still exist next to each other. Muhammad helped me to draw the map of the unrecognized villages, and we remained friends. In 2004, when the village was recognized by the state, I called Muhammad from Amsterdam. He told me that he was very happy with the recognition, but there was a catch. The recognition was tied to a master plan. The plan was drawn by a government-appointed architect, and it constrained the village development. For instance, areas in the plan that were designated for future expansion, like commerce or open communal spaces, were already occupied with the villagers' homes. The gap between the reality on the ground and the governmental plan subjected the villagers to a new bureaucratic struggle. Now every single house had to be legalized in a separate procedure. Until today, only 2 houses in the village were legalized. These houses are also the only houses with access to water and electricity, and they try to share it with the entire village. Confronting this story, I have decided to start FAST, Foundation for Achieving Seamless Territory. FAST is a practice on the intersection of architecture, planning, and human rights. And I use FAST as a platform to experiment with all sorts of professional methods and representation formats to expose such situation. And the situation in Ein Hod both pressured and inspired me and all those who were involved with the project to be creative, idealistic, and pragmatic at the same time. We try to use art and architecture tools to create and advance an alternative vision for the future of Ein Hod. In 2004, we initiated an international architecture competition for the design of an alternative master plan for Ein Hod. At the end of the competition, we brought together a group of experts in land law, human rights, economics, and geography with the team that won the competition. We brought them all to the village, and we started a series of workshops. And we started actually designing the plan at that moment. We worked together with the inhabitants to produce this plan, and we tried to illustrate their vision and their desires. We followed the villager request to not use this project, and this was very important all through the project, not to use this project to advance political statements that can be used against them by the local authorities. They also continuously emphasized at the same time that the future vision should have no claims over their former village. They wanted to survive and live in peace with their neighbors. We respected their concern throughout the project, and we positioned their ideas in the boundaries of what is possible, and we provided the villagers with a document that they can use to negotiate their civic rights with the local authority. It was not about justice, it was about pragmatism. The motivation was straightforward to improve the current living condition of the community. After producing the plan, we realized that this is not enough because it's a very abstract document, and for someone who cannot read architectural plan or master plans, it becomes very difficult and boring looking document to read. It's not attractive to advocate with it. We decided to lobby the plan locally, and the main challenge at that point was how we bring the plan to life, and how we can convince the neighbors and the local planning authorities that we present a positive development not only for the village but for the entire region. Considering the history of the village, I decided to use art and art installation to mediate between the long-term vision and the reality on the ground. I asked Maurizio Bortolotti, a friend and an Italian art curator, if he would like to help me realizing this idea. He agreed, and we started inviting artists to join us in the village. For everyone, the context was very compelling. The artists remained in the village for weeks. They were hosted by the local families. We didn't take hotels. And they submerged themselves in the village daily life. Together with the inhabitants, they slowly start creating new spaces in the village. Map Office, Map Office planted the gardens. I'll just show you quickly some of the work. Thomas Saraceno and Museo Aureo Solar inflated a beautiful space that was assembled with the children in the village. Deborah Solomon enacted a local market. Yona Friedman designed a series of installations that were realized in Ein Hod. One architecture marked the village resort overlooking the Carmel Mountain. Their installation was situated inside an active military fire zone that surrounds the village to this day. And the project roadmap by Multiplicity was installed inside an illegal and under construction home. Other works include a presentation by Dan Graham in a small cabin at the playground of the village, improvised schoolyard, and an embroidery work by Biren Strik and Nasrin Abul Hija was made together with the women of the village. We launched the alternative vision, or the expansion of the governmental plan, with a festival in the village. We inflated a communal structure and animated it with a program that, again, we curated with the villagers. We hosted a magic show at the request of the children of the village, and we projected movies at night. We had ideas about which movies to bring, and we had a whole list, but the teenagers of the village took over, and they preferred watching old American Westerns and karate films. We invited Carmel Sela. I don't know if any of you speak Hebrew. A very ironic name. We invited Carmel Sela, the head of the regional council of the Carmel region, to open the festival. Both Muhammad and Carmel gave speeches sharing their vision for the village. Muhammad's speech started with a quote by the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, saying, "If you will it, it is no dream." And Carmel Sela, the head of the regional council, promised to allocate resources to improve the infrastructure of the village. In the summer, I visited Ein Hod the last summer, and I went to Muhammad and see his kids, his grandkids, the village, and I showed him my kids. We shared experiences and life etc. And I wanted to see what type of development took place at that moment in this, like since the last time I was there. And it was nothing. It's all the same. It's like no matter what we did, it's like the system overpowered us and all those who tried to somehow contribute to a change. But Muhammad told me, don't lose hope. Stick with us. We continue to advocate the story. We keep telling the story. So still, till now, only 2 houses got legalized in the village. Okay, so the last project that I'm going to talk about is ZU, or the letter Z, just after Zionism. When Atlas of the Conflict came out, it generated a wide press coverage. And I got an invitation to exhibit the book in a gallery, in an architecture gallery in Maastricht. It was a very generous invitation. But the last thing that I felt doing was to blow up the maps and put it on the wall, especially after spending about 10 years making maps. It was, I needed a break. So I took the commission in one condition, that I will use the book as a departure point for a new project. And it was fine, I could do that. So I flipped through the book, through the atlas, back and forth, and I stopped at the last page of the lexicon. It included 2 seemingly unrelated terms, Zionism and ZU. While the term Zionism provided a brief description of the Zionist movement and its drive to establish a homeland for the Jewish people, the term ZU featured a news item and a postcard describing how a zookeeper in Gaza painted 2 white donkeys with black stripe and displayed them in his zoo as zebras. The zoo entry to the atlas came at the last moment. Just before the book went to print, I had a dinner with Khaled Khourani, a great Palestinian artist from Ramallah, who visited the Netherlands. Khaled wanted to borrow a Picasso artwork from a Dutch museum, and with that, he wanted to launch the first art museum in Palestine, in Ramallah, the only artwork. He did it, and the entire process, which is an amazing book, is published and described in a book that dedicated to this project. It's called Picasso in Palestine. But on his way back to Ramallah, he left me with a postcard of the Gaza zonkies. The story was so overwhelming in so many ways that I decided to include it in the atlas and end with it, the lexicon, but I forgot about it. So when I was asked to do the exhibition, I revised the material. And I decided to start a new research just on this last page, just on ZU and Zionism. This is what I'm going to do. This is going to be the project that will come out of this from this invitation. I realized throughout the research that both terms, already in the beginning of the research I realized it, that both the terms, or more precisely the urban zoo and the nation state, can be traced back to the age of reason, or to the epoch of classification. Looking at the transformation of the donkey into a zebra from the perspective of the Enlightenment period, one rather quickly realizes that something went here terribly wrong. I spent almost 1 year researching the Gaza Strip in the light of these 2 terms, and speculating about classification going wrong. At a certain point, we were 3 women working on this show, and it's the only thing that we did. I just gave birth, so I had a baby next to me, and we were like this community. And we started producing illustration that experimented with the notion of domestication of wild species and domesticity in general. We looked at craft associated with the domestic space. We began representing our images and diagram using embroideries, and we modeled spaces using macrame. We drew imaginary animals inspired by painting from the Enlightenment era, while replacing the background with elements borrowed from news items on the Gaza Strip. The F-16, the flotilla, the tunnels, and the walls replaced the church towers and the farmland that was typically found in old classification drawings. To produce the final set of embroidery, we collaborated with a small NGO, also of women, that adopted a group of women in the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. And they embroidered our last drawings. And they sent us this email with this letter with 3 clauses saying that the women who embroidered our drawings were sitting under a tree guarding their crops from baboons. We collaborated with a Dutch fashion designer, Connie Groenwegen, on the design of a soft pigeon cage. And we turned the architecture gallery into a menagerie. Sorry. And we completely engaged with the notion of a paradox. The animals in the exhibit included donkeys, rats, and pigeons, and they were cared by an activist from the Animal Liberation Front. The zoo was designed as a cage that is transformed into a house. The house walls included a density map of the Gaza Strip. The square shapes of the diagram were used to form both windows and cages. On the other side, we had sand and an archive. The architecture gallery was situated on the border with Belgium, where people have larger houses, or at least bigger than the houses that the Dutch has. And they love having donkeys as pets. In the weekends, our Belgian neighbors came with their donkeys to the architecture gallery and proudly displayed them at zoo. While working on the project, I contacted Mahmoud Baragut, the zookeeper from the Maryland Zoo in Gaza, through Facebook. When we talked for the first time, he was no longer in Gaza. He received a special visa and a scholarship to study engineering in Germany. So I found him in Germany, studying engineering. I invited him to join the opening of the exhibition in the south of the country, in Maastricht. And we spent a couple of days together. We drove north to Amsterdam, and we visited the zebras in Artis, one of the oldest urban zoos in Europe. And Mahmoud told me that it was the first time that he saw an actual zebra. So this last project enabled me to discuss the existence and life in Gaza from an unexpected perspective. I was not attempting to be politically correct, not at all. It was an advocacy project that aimed at using design to make people feel uncomfortable. Zoo was reviewed by the media, both in the culture section and in the news. It attracted many visitors who came to see Zoo, and they stumbled upon Gaza. At the border Ecologies version of Zoo, there is only one map of the Gaza Strip and the catalog of the exhibition with the essay of Sarah Roy, who is here with us, that helped me get an understanding of all the complex data and information and the situation, this harsh reality in the Gaza Strip. So I recommend, if you want to understand better what is happening there, not that you can really understand, but read about it. And I warmly recommend to read Sarah's work. So the diagram at the exhibition depicts the Israeli-imposed siege on the Strip. Gaza area measures to 141 square miles. Is the home of 1.9 million people. 1.3 of them are refugees from the 1948 war. Gaza is surrounded by a big wall, a 25-foot high barrier that runs along 38.8 miles of land. Its 12 miles coastline is controlled by warships and drones, and its airspace is restricted, and its airport was bombarded multiple times during the recurring wars. Throughout this project, the complexity that was extrapolated from the action of Mahmoud, who turned a white donkey into a zebra, engaged and addressed a wider conversation on architecture, colonization, modernity, and war. In Zoo, I tried to bring together small and big narratives and ideas about space and the places that we create and inhabit. And I also tried to do it in the other projects that are exhibited here in Village, Atlas, Blue, Hotel Abkhazia. Yeah, you can visit the exhibition or read the books that are accompanied to the work, with the work to get a more insight of the processes and the projects. And lastly, Diane, you mentioned it. On Friday, I will talk about and share the project I'm currently engaged with. It's called Blue Architecture of UN Peacekeeping Missions. It's a long project that tries to map and make visible the impact and footprint of UN peacekeeping operations on the built environment, on a natural environment. And at this moment, we are working with UN agencies to try to develop indicators to how to measure this footprint in order for them to be able to engage with it and develop policy that can change some of their footprints. That's it. Thank you.
I think we should open it up for questions. I think we can be here till 1:30 or so. Do you want to stay up front, you brother? Please.
Thank you, Malkit. That was very interesting. I come from Israel, and I support your framing the illegal, immoral, and strategically misguided notion of building settlements, and your work in Ein Hod. Next time I'm in Hod, I'll try to go to Ein Hod and see what's there. However, there are many pieces missing from this presentation in terms of context and some balance. And I have a few points. Just feel free to, I can read all of them, and then you can answer all of them if you want.
We want to keep questions, so make sure it's not like too long. So
I'll make them. So I'll just read all of them briefly, and then you can respond to whatever you want. I grew up in a mosheva. The moshevot were actually purchased, not occupied. Most of the land was purchased from the Arabs, and there was even a plan to purchase all the land. So not everything was just military. The wars, 48 and 67, were defensive wars against wars of annihilation. This is how Israel came to the armistice lines of 49. This is how we ended up with the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Might be worth mentioning, including the fact that Gush Etzion, which was Jewish, was massacred and expelled, never let back. There was a continuous Jewish presence in Hebron for millennia that was then kicked out and never allowed to return. No word about the Jewish refugees, not from post-Holocaust Europe, not from Muslim countries, all the way from Morocco to Iran, that now constitute half the Jewish population in Israel, and the Ma'abarot, the Jewish refugees camps in Israel. And that can be an interesting kind of parallel of population swap and how that ended up being. The Bedouin community and the unrecognized villages. It's interesting, just for clarity, to say that there were plans, about 7 planned cities for the Bedouin diaspora were planned, and again, even mentioning that they tried to reconcile the problem of these unplanned, unrecognized villages. I have very few short points, like the fences. Building fences is because of the Second Intifada, that if it happened in the US, it would be 55,000 casualties and 1 million wounded.
Yep.
This is when Israel built fences. The scale is just 9 miles.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
want to give Malkit a chance to answer you, but I feel like I need to say one thing.
Yes.
And that is, and it will be a question that I'll ask you later, maybe after you respond a little bit. I guess I just want to underscore, maybe I didn't do a good enough job in introducing Malkit and her presentation today. But this is a design school, and Malkit is presenting her work that deals with mapping, space, politics, art, architecture, which kind of is also threading through all the presentations he's giving, which is not to say that this isn't an inherently political project, which it obviously is. So I just want to make sure that, and I'm going to give you back the microphone now, that the question is allows us in this audience to basically talk about the role of those disciplines in dealing with and addressing with issues of conflict in general. It's not a positioning about a side. Obviously, Malkit has her position, as do all artists, architects, etc. So I just want to make sure that this doesn't become a rehearsing of the kind of history of the struggle and the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because we don't have enough time for that, and there'll be other sets of questions. So, yeah.
Just to answer that, Malkit offhandedly conducted an indictment against Israel and Zionism. I'm saying that if you want to learn about this conflict in context, at least give the appearance of a balanced wave about the Jewish refugees, about the Moshavot, about efforts by Israel to reconcile the unrecognized Bedouin towns, and so on. There isn't even an appearance of balance.
I would like to answer. So first of all, thank you very much for these comments, and I think they are valid. These projects are projects that it's a narrative and it's a process that I brought together. Obviously, reality is very complex, and you have multiple narratives, and some of the narratives I could include, some not. I wanted to address the issues of the unrecognized, let's talk about the unrecognized Palestinian villages. The unrecognized Palestinian villages are not a Bedouin diaspora. I don't know where this Bedouin diaspora comes from, but it's a situation that these are inhabitants that were living on that land the entire time. They were removed several times by different regimes, by force. The only seven Arab cities that were ever designed and built in Israel are the 7 cities for the Bedouin villagers, which are like a concentration cities. It's like, let's make sure they don't spread over the land and concentrate them in 7 cities such that we can control their sprawl. Even though that it's not a sprawl, but it's their livelihood. So to control their livelihood, the Israel government initiated, and Ministry of Interior Affairs initiated this master plan of the Negev, and I have a process. Actually, I have a documentation of the entire process, including maps from the Israeli administration. So that's my way of bringing out the narrative, and you have your way, and there are multiple ways, and this is it's a complex reality, and all the narratives are valid. I'm not here to say what you are saying. I agree with what you are saying, because many of the things that you said happened, but this is the narrative of this project and the focus of this project.
All I ask is to try to show the complexity, not just one side of the complexity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You may have tried. I think you did a great job introducing Malkit, and I appreciate the amount of work you put into this, but we are in an academic institution, not just a design school, and there is a level of completeness and context that should be part of a presentation like this, which I have to agree with these questions is lacking from this completely. And I'm just curious to know what you mean by seamless territory, right? Because there have been times that the UN and the Israeli government both have tried to at least achieve a seamless Jewish or seamless Palestinian territory, and in the actual Declaration of Independence of Israel, they welcome their Arab neighbors, and also, I don't think you've spoken about the 1.3 million Israeli Arab citizens of Israel. So what do you mean by seamless territory?
I need an entire week. When you compress a presentation to 40 minutes, there is this amount of material that you can cover. Seamless territory. It's a very let's say simple story. It wasn't. After I talked with Muhammad and we decided to start fast, the Israeli government put on a website called Seam Zone, and the purpose of this website was to advocate the need of the separation wall. So they explained with data why they need the wall to be on this height and in this distance from the next houses. There's like these tiny sections of buildings and walls and snipers and. But it didn't make sense to us because it's not about connecting people, it's about separating and using space, to divide rather than to engage in reconciliation. So for us, the seamless territory came as a counter position to the Seam Wall website that Israeli brought up.
I'm going to jump in here for a second. I think that was a great question about the seam, and I made something of that in the introduction because I have a slightly different way of thinking about the seam. When I was involved in a project on Israel-Palestine, when I was at MIT, we did a global competition for ideas, and I remember several of them. Now I realize that either it was probably somebody on your team or somebody inspired by you. But I remember in our jury, which academics at MIT and from Israel and Palestine, global academics, et cetera, that, I have a couple comments about that, but that we were really drawn to the possibility of thinking about a seam because seam can be things stitched together, not separated. It was so much more powerful of an idea than border or wall, or whether you call it a separation wall or protection barrier, whatever. The language, it seemed like every language that was used was then kind of slightly abused, but then the concept of the seam held some promise. I don't hear people talking about it so much anymore, but it could be something that we could start more of a conceptual interrogation of it. Not just, let's talk, we're having next week, a week from tomorrow, an architect from Berkeley talking about the border between the U.S. and the United States. So the concept of the seam, I know you have a particular critique of the Israeli government's use of the concept, but I do think that calling attention to these different ways of, these different concepts that we can deploy to understand divisions and conflicts is a really important thing. The second thing I wanted to say after and I very much appreciate this idea. Of course, we're an academic institution. We happen to have a particular entry point into that here at the GSD, but of course we all are governed by the same kind of standards and ethics of kind of education and research. I guess I do want to say, as it will be no surprise, maybe I'm talking too much here, but I have yet to have been in a conversation about Israel and Palestine that didn't have the tenor of this conversation. So I think it comes with the territory. So my hope is that we can continue to kind of see what does Malkit's presentation reveal to us, whether it's about Israel and Palestine or about the profession of architecture, design, art, in addressing these intractable conflicts that continually produce these uncomfortable conversations. And I'm sure we have Sarah Roy here is probably in 50 million of these conversations all the time. People who work at, one of the things that I learned in that project at MIT was it was just always going to be lack of consensus. So that's going to turn me into a question for you, Malkit, that hopefully will be helpful to students. And my interpretation, I'm coming up with kind of a interpretive understanding of the arc of your work through the three projects. Maybe the fourth would be the last one. I guess This interpretation is kind of just to get things started, but one could think about the atlas and then moving to the kind of master planning recuperation of the village. So you see where I'm heading. The atlas, the village book, and then the most recent project, the zoo project, as kind of an arc of efforts on your part to confront what you see as a problem in the relationship in Israel and Palestine, with the first stage being kind of knowledge generation, with all the mapping over time and just kind of laying out, as you call them, the facts on the ground, but kind of really historical analysis to reveal to people who wouldn't have access to those maps necessarily really what has happened to the territory. The second project starts with some hope. It seems to me that something could be done on at one particular site in that large geography that you've traced over time, involving the creation of a new master plan and then moving to kind of an art project pretty soon after realizing the master plan was not really doing anything, even your alternative counter-critical, shall we say, master plan. So you start moving into what you called this pragmatic advocacy, but not focused on the social justice issues. And then you end with a final project, which seems to me just pure critique, maybe even cynical critique. And I'm just wondering whether that represents the arc of your own kind of personal experience in these years that you've been working on projects related to Israel, Palestine, or whether I'm superimposing something, whether there's a temporality of that work that also exists over the real world situation in Israel, Palestine. So I guess I want to understand a little more the arc of how you've changed your work.
I don't think I've changed my work. I think that it's a matter of constantly trying to learn and experiment and see, okay, so what are the tools that I have confronted with this reality? I am enrolled into long time ago, enrolled into an architecture school that doesn't give me the tools to deal with this reality. So I need to rethink them myself in a way and walk around and talk with social justice organization, grassroots organizations, trying to figure out what is happening in this ground, which I didn't know, or not to the extent of it. So yeah, it is about generating information, constantly flowing out, researching and bringing up all this research, making it accessible. And at the same time, it's a constant exploration. Okay, so this is the situation, what can I do? And you can you can take different voices when you're confronted with such complexity. You can become very critical, and many of my colleagues are taking a very critical position, which I find many times very paralyzing, because once you say, okay, this is I'm going to advocate for justice. Okay, what is justice? Justice for whom? Justice by whom? And then when you go into measurable indicators and move to pragmatism, then you can actually do something or propose an alternative or show a way to engage with the environment in a different way than the institutional way. And you can give indicators to the institutions to work next to that, let's say, a body of knowledge that you have created or ideas that you might have, etc. And you can start challenging institutions to change. And there is I don't see this project as, of course, there is a personal evolution in engaging with conflict and conflict areas, but I'm still hopeful, and I want to keep this attitude because I don't want to move into a position in which I cannot do anything anymore.
Interesting. So you're constantly trying new ways to engage, innovating a new kind of methodologies and techniques to engage with the same set of problems, and that maybe comes because you you've already done one thing, so you don't want to do another mapping or et cetera. So I think that's a really interesting response. The reason I want to pick up something, and I don't know if we have students here who are in the Master of Design Studies, but it seems to me that I could say that your first phase was like the ULE phase, like the large mapping. The second phase is kind of the risk and resilience phase. Oh, well, you know, we want to think pragmatically. We want to actually do something. We don't want to just like show what's out there. We want to kind of move forward, have some advocacy, generate some resilience by creating some sense of like engagement with a state, even though dealing with master plans is almost impossible. And the third stage is the art in the public domain stage, which is, critical conservation is in there in the second stage with the villages. So the reason I summarize that for you, I'm thinking, what should we be learning here in our programs? Do we want these to be separate? This is not your problem, but I was like, separate entry points. Or should there be some engagement across all of those methodologies and techniques? I don't know if anybody, I don't have to put you on the spot because, we've got students here. We've got Rosetta, the co-director of that. Yeah. Does anybody have, yeah.
So I'm an MDes in art design and public domain.
Oh, cool.
And thank you. Although I don't think I need this, but. Oh, sure. Okay, the recording. So I think maybe the third project, although I definitely don't agree with the idea of Zionism and zoo being in the same conversation. I find it very insulting. But with that being said, I think that that is what gives me hope, is on this kind of micro scale of communities working together and potentially doing art projects perhaps with Israelis and Palestinians together, as opposed to taking a political standpoint and perpetuating these conversations that, as you've said, have been going nowhere for a very long time. So the third phase with art design in the public domain type work, arts work, or even the second project that you'd spoken to, which deals with things not on this large mapping scale, because I think that's a politically motivated thing in the first place to map sometimes, oftentimes. But this whole idea of actually working on the communal level is very exciting. And perhaps in the next phase, that could be an interesting place for the fourth zone of your work to go.
Yeah, excellent. And to pick up on that, I think in the concern with in the middle phase with the master planning, and being in a planning department, I understand the frustration with thinking that master planning, even an alternative master plan, is going to do something. I completely agree with you that it has to be a document for engagement and debate and discussion, and master plans can do that. But you don't expect that to solve the problems, but you start the political engagement or discussion that solves the problem, or that starts to get people together to think about problem solving. But even in that second phase, the art dimension was really important to get people to become interested in dealing with something as boring and top-down and comprehensive as a master plan.
I think the power of this profession, and I look at it as a whole, I don't look at it as architecture, planning, landscaping.
Right.
I look at it as one thing. And throughout all the projects, it's a constant navigation between scales and methods. I cannot understand how you can separate the human being that is living in an area where your project, your large master plan or vision is going to be topped down on from the vision. So I think you always need to navigate between all these scales. So I wouldn't like to exclude the master plan or exclude one of the methods, but I think you need to be flexible and to have the tools to constantly navigate between the different scales. And yeah, this is where I find also the beauty in this profession, is this possibility to have not an overview, but to engage with these different systems at the same time. And through art, you can engage on one level. Through master plan, you can engage with institutions.
Right.
And yeah.
Cool.
What exactly is your audience? How do you perceive your audience? Who are you trying to convince?
Ooh. Who is my audience? I'm here. I'm talking to academics, explaining my work. Most of the time I'm alone doing research or with a small office. We just got a commission from 2 missions to the UN to conduct research for them on spaces and places that no one ever researched before, that they found these methods that we have developed over the time actually important and useful to incorporate in the understanding, for instance, of peacekeeping missions. The reaction that I receive on the work coming from everywhere. It's as I said, the books or the material that comes out is covered both in the news section of a newspaper and in the culture section. So the audience is wide, and the material is accessible and open, and anyone who wants to see what we produce at FAST can just go online and see our work. We upload everything online.
So, Sylvia, I can make a closing remark. Do you have a question?
Hi. I wanted to ask whether you could talk a bit more about this concept of border ecologies, and why did you come up with this term, and what does it mean for you? Because I can see it somewhere, I think, in all of the projects, but I'd be interested to hear you talking about it a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I think it's very difficult. I think it's part of the conversation that we just had. It's very hard to or it's impossible to isolate elements from their contexts. And once someone, in the context of this, once someone design a wall or implement a wall that cuts through the land, it's something that disturbs the entire ecosystem. You know, it disturbs everything. It disturbs both the human people's livelihood and nature. It's something that is big, and the consequences of such action should be taken into account in a broader sense of the environment and landscape, and as an ecological system that has multiple footprints and outputs, and these things should be taken into account, and very often they don't. It's like, let's make a wall, we split these 2 people, then we solve the problem, and that's not the case. I think this is what I try to advocate: is let's look at the system in its entirety.
Well, I will try to make a closing remark based on both knowing Malkit very well, but also picking up on the tone in the room, which is, it's interesting that you ask about audience. I think if I may, in many respects, the way you work is deeply personal. So at first or before it's a public audience, it seems to me that it's your own interest in paying attention to something that develops into a more public project. So you could say that, the get-go is that you're your own audience, which is what actually laminates the work to a much more of an artistic practice. In this setting, Malkit is not an academic. She is not coming as the professor of whatever from Manchester. She's coming as the, the director of FAST, who really has an art practice that she developed because, and in a way, you saw how policy becomes spatially programmatic, and it affects people. And you saw that in a place that you're from. And so it started in a deeply personal way as an architect, and it has escalated. And in that escalation, I think that's where my comment lies, which is to most of you, I think, who are MDes, which means you're in a post-professional degree, you're looking to bear down on something. You're looking for development more than ideas. In many ways, Malkit had one idea, but she has developed it over and over and over at different scales, with different projects, with different people, in different environments. And it's that kind of paying attention to something over, 15 years. When the Atlas came out, when I knew you, wait, I don't know, because I don't have the book in front of me. Is it 2004? But when did you start working on it?
2001.
2001. Okay, so as an architecture student, and so to take a trajectory from 2001 to 2017 in this room, and to be able to spend that kind of deep attention and change your mind along the way. all the time, as far as I know. And as Malkit changes her mind, she tries to reveal something else to a public. That means excluding, it means laminating and delaminating along the way, but it's quite a personal, it's to me quite personal. And I think if many of us could spend that kind of deep attention on our own personal narratives, experiences, contexts, and politics, we would even be articulating a different kind of methodology, rather than I'm borrowing the quan and the quant and whatever my method is, and I can put it on paper and it seems to be a checklist. You're designing a methodology, you design a practice, you design engagement, and that's really where the heart of the project itself lies. And I use the term design broadly. So for that, I hope, at the very least, it's an inspiration for how we work, and how hard it is to describe how we work as designers in an academic setting. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks.
Great. I just want to say that I hope that those of you who are here and your brother will come on Tuesday when we hear Professor Ronald Rael, I think he's Mexican-American, talk about the border wall between the United States and Mexico. It will continue some of the themes that you've laid on the table for us. I totally agree with Rosetta, this idea of personal. Actually, the personal passion behind your projects, and I'm saying that about myself, and I've been in this game for a long time as a professor, but all of you who are maybe finishing some of the degrees, this is absolutely central to kind of the power of your work. If it's abstract, it's going to be obvious, right? If you really could care less about the topic that you're writing about, it's going to be clear. And so you have done an amazing amount of, and I love the way that you have actually shifted your entry point as you're constantly looking to reveal other ways to engage for yourself and to other people with the issue of Israel-Palestine and border and conflict and peace, which is this latest project. So thank you, Malkit, for
Thank you.